I can still remember that night like it was yesterday. It started like any other, quiet, peaceful, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside our little cabin in the backwoods of America. My wife Elsie and I had lived here for so many years, just the two of us, our old house and our two dogs, Duke and Daisy. Life had settled into a rhythm over the years. The storm outside, the creaking of the house, the occasional howl of a distant coyote, all things that were familiar to us. But that night was different. We were both asleep, tucked in bed, the storm tapping at the windows like an old friend. I'd drifted into a dream, one of those dreams where you're not quite asleep but not quite awake either. It wasn't until Duke and Daisy started barking, loud, frantic barks, that I snapped back to reality. I shot up in bed, my heart racing, my old joints protesting as I tried to stand. Elsie stirred beside me, rubbing her eyes. "What in the world, she muttered, sitting up. Her voice was thick with sleep, but I could tell she was already worried. I could hear the dogs barking, getting more desperate by the second. Their barking always meant something was wrong. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my old jacket off the chair by the bed and went for the door, Elsie trailing behind me, her slippers slapping softly against the wooden floor. Outside, the storm was fierce. The wind howled, pushing the rain sideways, and the trees swayed under its force. Duke and Daisy were circling our yard, barking like they'd lost their minds. Something was out there. Something had stirred them from their usual calm. "What do you think it is, Harold?" Elsie asked, her voice tight with worry as she clutched my arm. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely cutting through. "The wind." But it's not like them to act like this. We stepped out into the mud, squinting through the sheets of rain, trying to see through the night. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But no. There in the shadows of our backyard was something small, trembling, its eyes wide with fear. Duke and Daisy were circling it, their barks turning from threats to confused whimpers. My heart skipped a beat. A baby. A bear cub. Elsie gasped beside me. "Oh, Harold, what in the world?" I froze, unsure of what to do. The cub was so small, probably no older than a few months, and it was shaking in the rain, its paw clearly injured. It had to be lost, frightened, and it was in our yard. No idea how it had gotten there, but one thing was clear: it needed help. The dogs, seeing us, stopped their frantic barking and watched us warily. Duke, ever the protector, growled softly, but Daisy was already looking at the cub with a strange, almost sympathetic gaze. "We can't just leave it out here," I said, my voice filled with a mix of concern and uncertainty. Elsie was already moving toward the little cub, her heart bigger than any fear she had. We carefully approached, keeping our distance from the dogs, who were still on edge. The cub looked up at us, its eyes full of fear, and then it lowered its head in exhaustion. "I think it's hurt," Elsie said softly, crouching down beside the cub. "We need to help it." My mind raced. What do we do now? I wasn't exactly a wildlife expert, but I knew enough to see that this cub was in no shape to be out there on its own. Elsie was already gently running her hand over its back, calming it. I had to admit, it was a sight that struck me deeply. Despite the storm, despite our age, there was no question that we couldn't just leave it to fend for itself. "Let's bring it inside," I said, taking a step forward. "We'll figure out what to do in the morning." Elsie nodded, relief washing over her face. We gently lifted the cub, carrying it into the warmth of the house where it would be safe, for now. As I shut the door behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something that would change everything for us. We didn't know what to expect once we brought the little cub inside. Our house, small and cozy, suddenly felt too big for just the two of us, and the strange, trembling animal we now had to care for. We set it down gently on a few old blankets by the hearth, where the warmth from the fire would help dry it off. Duke and Daisy, still on edge, sat by the door watching cautiously. I think they understood that this was no ordinary guest, but their instincts were still unsettled. Elsie bent down to examine the cub more closely, her face full of concern. "It's a grizzly, Harold," she said softly, her fingers brushing over the cub's injured paw. Poor thing must have gotten separated from its mother. I knelt beside her, the weight of the situation sinking in. The cub's fur was wet and matted from the rain, and it had a small gash on its leg, likely from some sort of trap or thorn. But despite its injuries, it looked so small and fragile, nothing like the mighty creature it would eventually become. For a moment I just sat there staring at it. "What are we supposed to do with it, Elsie?" I asked, feeling completely out of my depth. "We can't just keep it, can we?" Elsie, who had always been the kinder, more compassionate one between the two of us, sighed. "I don't know. I don't even know how to care for a bear cub, but we can't just turn it out into that storm." She was right. We had no idea what we were getting into, but abandoning the poor thing didn't seem like an option. I grabbed a clean cloth and gently began drying the cub's fur. It flinched at first, its little body shivering, but then it settled. I could see its eyes starting to droop as exhaustion took over. Elsie ran to the kitchen to get some warm milk, hoping it might help calm the little creature, but we both knew it probably wasn't the right thing for a bear. Still, it was all we had at the moment. We spent the rest of the evening caring for the cub, feeding it what little we could, and making sure it was as comfortable as possible. It was strange, something about its quiet trust, the way it curled up by the fire and let us care for it, made my heart swell with both fear and tenderness. After a few hours, I realized something. In all my years, I had never seen anything like this before. It wasn't just the bear cub that felt out of place in our home. It was me, too. I had spent my life working the land, fixing fences, tending to crops, but never had I felt so unprepared for something so simple. All I knew was that we had to try. "I'll build a little pen for it tomorrow, get it comfortable," I told Elsie, though I wasn't sure how I would do that. The idea of keeping the cub locked up felt wrong, but we couldn't just leave it roaming around either. It needed a place to heal, to feel safe. She nodded, her hand gently resting on the cub's back. "We'll figure it out together." That night we both sat up late, keeping watch over the cub, unsure of what the next day would bring. I remember watching the flames flicker in the hearth, their light casting shadows on the walls. I didn't know how long this strange little chapter of our lives would last, but I had a feeling we would look back on it someday and know it had changed us. When we finally went to bed, Elsie looked at me, her eyes tired but full of warmth. "You think its mother is out there somewhere?" she asked quietly. I thought about it for a moment before responding. "I hope so. But if she is, she's probably looking for her baby right now." Elsie didn't say anything else, but I could see in her eyes that she shared my worry. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing the soft rustling of the cub, the gentle breathing that somehow felt both peaceful and fragile. It felt like we had a responsibility now, not just to this little creature, but to the wild world it came from. But as I lay there, trying to ignore the creaking of the house and the storm outside, a part of me realized something that made my heart heavy. No matter what we did, this wouldn't be our cub forever. The days that followed felt like a strange mix of chaos and calm. The bear cub, which we had tentatively named Bruno in a moment of fondness, grew stronger, though his injury still made him slow and a bit unsteady on his feet. We did the best we could. Elsie tended to him with the gentleness of someone who had spent years nurturing and caring for those in need, and I built a small pen outside for him, making sure it was sturdy and secure enough to keep him contained but comfortable. We weren't sure how long it would take for him to heal, or even if he'd make it through the night, but we both knew that whatever happened, we had to try. Elsie had done some research on what to feed him, mostly berries, fish, if we could, catch it, and nuts, but we quickly realized that bears didn't eat like dogs or even like humans. Bruno seemed to have his own taste, though, and after a few trials we figured out what he liked best. He would eat almost anything we gave him, though sometimes I thought he was just too polite to refuse. It became a routine. Elsie would spend her mornings gathering food for him, while I'd fix up his pen and check the traps for anything he might enjoy. It wasn't glamorous work, but it felt good to do something. As the days passed, Bruno grew more comfortable with us. It was a funny thing. At first he seemed so distant, as if he didn't understand why we were helping him, but after a while I could see a change. He started to trust us more, and we began to trust him. The first time he crawled into my lap, resting his head on my knee as if to say thank you in his own way, I was taken aback. I had been expecting something wilder, more distant, but instead I was faced with the gentlest soul I had ever encountered. The bond between us was unexpected, almost sacred in its simplicity. Elsie, too, found herself drawn to Bruno in ways she hadn't anticipated. She would talk to him as if he were a child, soft words, soothing tones. Sometimes when I would catch her gazing at him, I'd see a faraway look in her eyes, a kind of nostalgia mixed with affection. It was as though, in some strange way, Bruno had reminded her of something long forgotten, something pure and innocent that even the most hardened hearts could still feel. "Do you think he remembers his mother?" Elsie asked one evening as we watched Bruno frolic clumsily in the yard. He had gotten a little bolder with time, testing the limits of the pen we'd built for him. I thought about it for a moment, watching the cub tumble and roll, his eyes shining with unspoken curiosity. "I don't know," I said finally, "but I think he feels safe here. He knows we won't hurt him." That night we had a conversation that I had been avoiding for days. As much as I had grown fond of Bruno, as much as we had both become attached to him, I knew it couldn't last forever. He was a wild animal, and eventually he would grow too big for our little house, too wild for us to contain. I could see it in his eyes, the curiosity, the longing for something beyond the walls of the pen, something he couldn't express but was always there. "He's going to need to go back to the wild soon," I said quietly, after a long pause. Elsie didn't look at me at first. She was focused on the fire, her face lit up by its orange glow, but I knew she was listening. "I know," she whispered, "but it feels like letting go of a part of ourselves." Her words hung in the air, between us heavier than I expected, and they were true in a way. Bruno had become more than just a bear cub to us. He had become a reminder of our own vulnerability, of how the world outside our little bubble of safety could be unpredictable, raw, and unyielding. But it had also reminded us that love, in all its forms, could bridge any gap, even that between man and beast. I spent the next few days wrestling with the decision. Part of me wanted to keep Bruno with us, to protect him from the dangers of the world outside. But deep down, I knew that doing so would be unfair to him. He wasn't meant to live a domestic life. He was meant for the wild, for the forest, and the mountains and the rivers. It was in his blood. One afternoon I took him out of the pen to let him run around the yard. As he bounded away, his little paws pounding against the earth, I could see how happy he was. The way he looked at the trees, the way his body seemed to fill with life when he caught a glimpse of a bird in the sky. It was a reminder of why we had helped him in the first place. Bruno wasn't just an injured animal. He was part of something, much bigger than us. And so when Elsie and I sat down later that night, the decision felt a little easier. "We'll let him go," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "We'll give him back to the wild, to where he belongs." Elsie looked at me, her eyes reflecting the same quiet sadness that I felt. "It's the right thing to do, Harold," she said softly. "We can't keep him forever." I nodded, though the thought of saying goodbye to Bruno filled me with a sadness I couldn't quite explain. I was proud of us for having cared for him, for doing everything we could to give him the chance to heal. But part of me also knew that letting him go was the greatest act of love we could offer him. The next few days were full of quiet reflection, and as Bruno grew stronger, we both began to prepare ourselves for the inevitable. The bond we had formed with him had changed us, and we would never forget the little cub that had come into our lives when we least expected it. The night it happened, the storm was as fierce as the first night Bruno arrived. The wind howled, the rain came down in torrents, and the trees outside bent with the force of the tempest. It felt as though nature itself was trying to remind us of something, of the wild, of the untamable, of the life we had been trying so hard to tame inside our little house. I had just finished securing the doors and windows against the wind when I heard it. The barking of Duke and Daisy, frantic and sharp, cut through the storm like a knife. My heart lurched as I glanced at Elsie. She had been sitting by the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap, staring into the flickering flames. We both knew what that sound meant. I grabbed my jacket, and Elsie was already at the door waiting. Her hand shook as she reached for the handle, her face pale in the dim light of the room. "It's them," she whispered. Her voice was tight, full of something I couldn't quite name. We hurried outside, not caring that the rain soaked us through. The wind whipped at our faces, and the dogs were barking like they had lost their minds, racing around the yard as if they were chasing something we couldn't see. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, not from the cold but from the primal instinct that had begun to tug at me, the kind of instinct that told me this wasn't just a chance encounter. There, at the edge of the yard, I saw her. The mother bear. Her silhouette was enormous, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark as she stood in the rain, her gaze locked onto the pen where Bruno had been resting earlier. For a moment, we all stood frozen in place. Bruno, who had been inside with us just moments before, was standing at the edge of the pen, his small body trembling as he stared at her, his mother. I could feel the weight of the moment settle around us. The wild was back, and it wasn't asking permission. It was taking back what was hers, and Bruno, our little cub, was about to face that truth. Elsie's breath caught, and I could hear her voice quiver. "Harold, he knows it's her." I didn't know what to say. It was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing I'd ever seen. Bruno, in all his confusion and fear, was being called home. The bond we had formed with him, as deep as it was never meant to last. He wasn't ours to keep, and the wild had come to claim him back. I felt a tug at my heart, a deep, aching sadness that made my chest tighten. But I also felt a kind of peace, an understanding that this moment was the right thing, the only thing. The mother bear was here to take her cub, and we were simply the caretakers for a time. The rain beat down harder, and I could hear the growls of the mother bear, now low and powerful, as if calling to Bruno, urging him to come. The cub hesitated, his small body trembling, but he didn't resist. Slowly, he took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing just a few feet away from the mother. The connection between them was instant, undeniable. Bruno's body relaxed as he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of recognition and trust. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We stood there, watching this reunion unfold before us, knowing that the bond we had shared with this cub, this little bear, was nothing compared to the bond he had with his mother. Finally, Elsie's voice broke the silence. "It's time," she whispered, her words carried away by the wind. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. I could see it in the way Bruno looked up at us, his eyes meeting ours one last time. I couldn't tell if he was thanking us, or if it was simply a moment of understanding between us, but in that fleeting glance I saw it. Gratitude. Not for the food, not for the shelter, but for the love we had given him when he needed it most. I stepped forward, slowly, my heart pounding. The mother bear watched us closely, her eyes wary but not threatening. I reached for the door to the pen, opening it slowly. Bruno hesitated for just a moment, then looked up at us one last time before stepping out into the rain, into the embrace of his mother. As the two of them stood there side by side, looking back at us for one final moment, I felt a quiet wave of emotion sweep over me. It was bittersweet, painful, and yet somehow peaceful. The mother bear and her cub turned, disappearing into the forest with a soft rustle of leaves, and just like that, they were gone. The wild had taken back what was always meant to be its own. We stood in the rain for a long time after they left, both of us feeling the weight of the moment, the emptiness in the air where Bruno had once been. "It was the right thing to do," I said quietly, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. Elsie didn't respond right away. She just stood there, her face wet with rain and tears, her hands pressed together in front of her chest. Finally she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," she said, "but I will miss him." And in that moment I realized that we had loved him not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, a respect for life, for the wildness in him, and for the understanding that love, real love, means letting go when the time is right. The days after Bruno's departure were harder than I thought they would be. We woke up each morning to the silence that felt heavier now, as if something fundamental had shifted within us. The dogs, Duke and Daisy, still looked out toward the woods at times, as if expecting the cub to come bounding back through the rain or the trees. But Bruno was gone, and the yard, once full of the rustling sounds of a young bear's clumsy movements, was eerily quiet. Elsie and I spent our days the way we always had, tending to the garden, fixing the old barn and checking on the animals. But there was a quiet emptiness now, a space where Bruno had once been, and though we filled our hours with the work of life, we both knew that something had changed. One afternoon, about a week after Bruno left, I was sitting by the fire, nursing a cup of coffee when Elsie came to sit beside me. Her face, though soft with age and wisdom, was still the face I had fallen in love with all those years ago. And yet, there was a quiet sadness in her eyes now, a reflection of the emptiness we both felt. "He's out there," she said softly, staring into the flames. "He's out there in the forest growing stronger, and part of me wonders if he'll ever think of us." I looked at her, my heart aching with the same question. I didn't have the answer, but I understood what she was saying. Bruno had been with us during a difficult time in our lives, and the bond we'd shared had felt like something that couldn't easily be explained. There was a strange sense of pride in knowing that we had helped him survive, helped him heal. But there was also a sense of loss, of something irretrievably gone. "I think he'll remember," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "not because he owes us anything, but because we gave him something that will stay with him. We gave him love. And love, Elsie, that's not something that just disappears." She nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, though she wiped them away quickly. We both knew that there was no way to keep him here with us. He was wild, and we had set him free. But in our hearts we had done the right thing. The pain was just part of it. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It wasn't that I was paranoid or imagining things. No, this was different. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something large and shadowy moving at the edge of the woods, just out of sight. But I never saw it clearly enough to be sure. I wondered if it was Bruno, or maybe his mother, keeping an eye on us from a distance. Then one morning, as I was working out near the field, I saw it, a flash of movement, too quick for me to make out at first, but when I turned my head, I saw them, Bruno and his mother standing at the edge of the forest. I froze, not daring to breathe as I looked at them. The mother bear was larger now, her coat thick and full, her eyes sharp and alert, and beside her stood Bruno, no longer the small cub we had cared for, but a young bear, still growing, still learning the ways of the wild. He stood taller now, his body strong, and he looked, well, at home. He didn't come any closer, but his eyes met mine for a moment, just long enough to recognize me. And in that moment, I saw something in his gaze that was both familiar and due, a quiet understanding, as though he knew we had cared for him and he was grateful. But it was time for him to move on, to be his own. The mother bear glanced at us briefly, then nudged Bruno gently, as if urging him to keep moving. And, without a sound, they turned and disappeared into the forest, their silhouettes swallowed by the trees. I stood there watching them go, my heart full of both sorrow and peace. I didn't say anything to Elsie when I came inside. I didn't need to. She knew. She knew that our love for Bruno had been enough, and it was time for him to live the life he was meant for. That evening we sat on the porch together, the quiet of the world around us settling in once more. The wind had died down and the sky was clearing, the first stars beginning to show. "Do you think he'll be okay out there?" Elsie asked, her voice soft, almost as if she were talking to herself. "I think he'll be just fine," I said, my voice steady, though my heart still felt heavy. "He's where he belongs now, and so are we." We didn't speak for a while after that, each of us lost in our thoughts. The world around us felt peaceful again, as though a chapter had closed, a chapter that had been difficult but necessary. The wild had taken Bruno, and we had given him up willingly because we loved him enough to do what was best for him. As the stars began to shine brighter overhead, I felt a sense of quiet gratitude settle over me. The little bear that had once been so lost and afraid had gone on to find his place in the world, And in some small way I knew that we had played a part in that. And though the world had moved on, I would never forget the kindness we had shown to a creature who, for a brief moment, had found safety in our care. The rain had passed, the wild had reclaimed its own,